Hey guys, it's Mika, and after all these years, I'm still just a medic. Today's video is about diabetes. Diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2, the differences and the commonalities. It's a video I wanted to make for years, never got around to, then I killed the channel. And now that I'm coming back, it's one of those videos I have to make right away. Because it's one of those things everybody discusses. And everybody has somebody in their family who's either a type 1 or type 2 diabetic. Now first, for the distributions. About 95% of all people with diabetes have diabetes type 2. Type 2 diabetes is a later diabetes. It happens later in life, usually around 45, and with a very, very high probability that person is adipose. So the person's overweight. The person usually has a distribution of fat around the midline, so where the belly button is, rather than around the hips or the legs or the shoulders or the arm or the face. The other thing is that diabetes type 2 usually comes in concert with other things like heart problems or eye problems, and all these are essentially caused by the diabetes but are being treated as one block, a cluster of symptoms called the metabolic syndrome. Type 1 diabetes is something you're born with. There's a problem with the immune system. The immune system mistakes the cells that produce insulin as foreign bodies and kills them. Children between 4 and 7, and then again between 10 and 14 is the two big spikes in the statistics, are diagnosed with diabetes type 1. But before we can talk about the different diabetes, we have to talk about the commonalities. And there's two things they both have in common: insulin and glucose. Insulin is a messenger hormone. Insulin is being secreted by the pancreas by cells called the beta cells. That's very important. You should maybe remember that one word, beta cells. It's being secreted in response to high sugar in the blood, high blood glucose. And if blood glucose is high, that's on one hand it's really good because we need glucose to function. On the other hand, it's not so good because as long as the glucose remains in the blood, it is dangerous. It's dangerous to nerves, it's dangerous to muscles, it's dangerous to your eyes, it's dangerous to your brain, it's dangerous to parts of your body that you really want to keep. So the glucose needs to get out of the blood quickly, usually within a few hours. And that means that the pancreas senses, okay, there is a lot of blood glucose right now, a lot of sugar in the blood, and it sends out insulin, or it synthesizes insulin from precursors, proinsulin, pre-proinsulin, and that becomes insulin, and it's being secreted into the bloodstream and it's being circulated. And as long as there's insulin in the bloodstream, our tissues know it's time to grab that energy and start working, start making things, start building new cells, start making hormones, all these things that cells do. A bunch of parts of our body don't need insulin as a messenger. For example, your brain. Your brain will always take the glucose it needs from the blood as long as there's glucose there. So in order to make sure that there's always a little bit of glucose there, when your glucose goes down, insulin production is stopped. Now, the not so important, they're very important, but not so important as the brain, cells in your body stop taking glucose out and leave the remaining glucose for the brain. That's the basics. Now, there are a few places in the body where we can store glucose. The brain isn't one of them. The brain can only grab glucose that's in the blood. It cannot store glucose and say, hey, right now there's high blood glucose levels, high blood sugar. I'm grabbing all the glucose I can. I'm going to store it in me, and when I need it, I can use it. No. The brain can only use the glucose that's in the blood. Your liver can store glucose, and your muscles can store glucose. Your muscles store glucose and never give it back. There's a little bit of a Hotel California, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So any sugar, any glucose that's in the muscles stays in the muscles and is being used for the muscles. In the liver, it's different. The liver saves that glucose in beautiful trees. It looks really, really beautiful in itself. And with another messenger hormone called glucagon, you can tell the liver to take that glucose and release it. Remember glucagon, release. We'll talk about this in a little bit when we come to diabetes type 2 and the dawn phenomenon. So, that's insulin. Insulin is a messenger. If insulin goes up, cells grab more glucose, and blood glucose goes down. If blood glucose goes down, it turns off insulin production. The other one is glucose. We've talked about, I think it's the word I use the most. We talked about it, but where does it come from? Well, it comes from food. You eat food, and food consists of a number of nutrients, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Carbohydrates can be really long chains called starches, shorter ones, oligosaccharides, and then monosaccharides. Monosaccharides is one sugar. All that gets transformed into glucose, fructose, and so on, and then gets absorbed into the bloodstream in the small intestine. So while you're eating, it's already being broken down. Your mouth breaks it down. There's both the mechanical breakdown by chewing, and then there is the saliva that breaks it down a little bit more. In your stomach, there's mechanical breakdown and there's chemical breakdown, and then it goes into your small intestine. That's the first part of your intestine, that's the duodenum, and it goes around. And in that place, it's being really, really, really like torn to shreds, turned into glucose, and then absorbed into the bloodstream. So that's glucose. Glucose gets eaten, gets absorbed into your bloodstream. That's the main source, and the other source is it can come from the liver, or it can come from internal storages if it's your muscles. What is type 1 diabetes? What's type 2 diabetes? Type 1 diabetes is the diabetes you get when your body mistakes the cells that produce insulin for an invader, for an enemy, and destroys it. It's an autoimmune disorder. Now, if you do not have cells to produce insulin, your body is never told, the cells in your body are never told to take the glucose out of the blood. Your brain uses a lot of the glucose, about 20%, but it doesn't use it all. So blood glucose goes up, goes up, goes up, and then these damages that I've been talking about, like to your nerves, to your muscles, to your eyes, they start to happen. Then glucose goes further up. This is a long-term problem, like with the high blood sugar that, it destroys parts of your body. But then glucose goes further up, and now your body tries really, really hard to get rid of that glucose because it's not good for it. So you get polyuria. You pee an awful lot. You drink something and it goes right through because your body tries to get that glucose out of it. You try to breathe it off, and so on and so on. And this is a life-threatening condition. The only way you can monitor and control type 1 diabetes is by taking blood glucose readings, either of your finger or of a machine. You might have seen videos with me with a little sensor here on my arm, usually on my right arm because, on my right arm because I'm taking my blood pressure on my left arm, but that monitor your blood glucose constantly. Some people just stick their finger a couple of times a day, and as a type 1 diabetic, you actually feel it when your blood glucose goes up or down. You develop like a seventh sense about that. Then when you take your blood glucose reading and it says it's very high or it's high, then you supplement insulin. First, in the morning and in the evenings, you usually give a baseline. It's called the basal amount of insulin. That helps during the day your body to do a little bit of work, to have insulin around to do basic work. But if you're getting these spikes, then you give something called a bolus, additional insulin, and you try to always moderate that around 100 milligrams per deciliter. That's what you want. That's where you want to be as a healthy person, as a diabetic. And you're doing this by doing the role of your pancreas. Of course, your pancreas is much better at this than you are with your needles, but you can try. Lately, people have been developing the so-called artificial pancreas. These are little machines that sit either on your tummy or on your leg, and they measure. They measure blood glucose concentration all the time, and if it goes up, they secrete a little bit of insulin, just at the way the pancreas would do. There are a number of companies that do it, and there are actually open source efforts to create these artificial pancreases without large pharma industry behind it. What's type 2 diabetes? Type 2 diabetes is usually marked by, in the beginning at least, by a still functioning pancreas. Your pancreas is not under attack. Your pancreas is creating insulin. Your cells have become resistant to that insulin. They are no longer as sensitive towards the insulin. So if the insulin comes by and says, please open up, take some of that glucose, the cell goes, nah, you always have so much blood glucose in you, I don't want to open right now, because for the cell, too much glucose is also not a good thing. So the cell basically goes, nah, don't want to do that right now. That is reduced insulin sensitivity. The pancreas is still secreting insulin. The cells don't listen to the pancreas, to the messenger hormone of insulin. So blood glucose keeps circling through your body, and if you eat regular schedule, morning, lunch and dinner, and maybe a few snacks in between, that means your blood glucose level goes up, because the parts of your body that don't need insulin signaling and the little bit that the cells actually take is not enough to get the blood glucose level down. It is marked exactly by the same problem. So you start peeing a lot because your body is trying to get rid of that glucose. And while it does not have these massive spikes to the top because your cells are still taking out some of the glucose, and while it does not have these massive bottom spikes that we will talk about in a second, it is a constant raised level of glucose in your blood, and that means that over time, over months and years, your eyes, your legs, and your nerves in your legs and your feet specifically suffer greatly. And that can lead to things like neuropathy, so that you lose feeling in a part of your body, eyesight problems, and so on and so on and so on. It also can lead through a number of other effects to heart problems. It can lead, it is not a good thing. It is really not a good thing to have high blood sugar levels all the time. So, type 1, the body destroys the cells that produce insulin. Type 2, the cells in the body do not listen to insulin anymore, even though the cells that produce it are still intact. Now, I should mention that in type 2 diabetes, there is a end state. It goes downhill. If you don't do anything about it, if you don't start, losing weight, eating healthier, getting that overall blood glucose level down, your pancreas never stops secreting insulin, because the pancreas senses high blood glucose levels all the time, secretes insulin. That fatigues those beta cells. I told you, remember the beta cells, that's the ones that are being destroyed, right? They're getting fatigued and they die. So in somebody with a long period of type 2 diabetes, they might actually get type 1 diabetes, destroyed beta cells. That's not a good thing, but usually we catch it in time, hopefully. There is, of the 95% of all diabetics that are type 2 diabetics, 75% remain undiagnosed for a long time. And we believe that only about 30 to 35% of people in Europe and the United States are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. We have a dark figure of 70% that have pre-diabetes, so they're going towards the type 2 diabetes, or have type 2 diabetes and are not diagnosed with it. Now, what are the dangers? The dangers of both, we've talked about type 2 diabetes. The big danger of type 2 diabetes is that by living with a constantly raised blood glucose level, you're doing damage to your body. And that is a long-term thing. It goes over months, over years. So before you start feeling the tingling in the legs and the vision problems, you have been a type 2 diabetic for quite some time. In type 1, things are way more acute. Let me give you 2 examples. Example number 1, you do not have insulin. For whatever reason, either you can't afford it, which is a problem in some parts of the world, or you do not believe in insulin. I've had patients who actually did not believe in insulin, and then that's what happens. Or you forget it, or you have an accident, or you are older and by your own and no longer able to go shop for insulin, or you have a memory problem and you forget it. So if you don't take insulin, your blood glucose level goes up, goes up, goes up, goes up, until it reaches extremely dangerous levels, and then you have an acute situation where you have to deal with this person almost immediately, or they will either have long-lasting damages or die. The other one is even more acute. Remember, I told you a type 1 diabetic has to put a needle in themselves and has to push a button or plunger down to get insulin into their body, emulating the function of their pancreas. Well, this is a little bit of math that you have to play, where you know I've eaten that, it has that much carbohydrates, my body usually reacts like this, so I should be taking that much insulin in. Sometimes we miscalculate, and what happens then is we give ourselves too much insulin. And because insulin stops when it goes down the absorption of glucose into the cells to make sure that the brain gets enough, if there's still insulin around, the cells will happily gobble away on all the glucose that's still in the blood, depriving the brain of its energy. And again, remember, I told you, the liver stores glucose, the muscles store glucose, the brain don't. So if there's no more glucose in the blood, if the blood glucose level sinks below a level of about 50 milligrams per deciliter, you know, remember I told you 100 milligrams per deciliter is what we aim for. 180 is considered high. 300 is a problem. 600 is a place that I sometimes see people at. But if it goes down to 50, then we're entering the point where the brain does no longer get enough glucose to function. There's also, if you had a little bit of physics in high school, there's the whole thing with osmotic pressure and so on, you know. So the brain is not getting enough glucose anymore, and then you get very tired and you fall asleep, and that's it. So for type 1 diabetics, the people that really emulate their own pancreas with a syringe, it is very important to monitor themselves so they don't fall too low, don't fall to a place where they can't even react to their own low anymore. The most dangerous time for type 1 diabetics is the night, and it's been, you know, in my youth, you had to set an alarm clock, and that alarm clock would ring, and then you would get up and you would take your blood glucose levels, and then you would go back to bed. Today, there's such a thing as a continuous glucose monitor. I told you about these little machines that sit on you and that constantly take your blood glucose, and they vibrate and they scream and they yell and they wake you up and tell you, you know, it's time to eat something. Now, how should you as a non-diabetic deal with people around you? The number one, the most important thing is, if somebody falls down, a type 1 diabetic, and becomes unresponsive, do not grab their insulin syringe and give them insulin, because they fall down because glucose is already very low. If you give them insulin, you lower the blood glucose even more. If somebody that you know that is a type 1 diabetic becomes unresponsive or starts to slur their words, their speech becomes weird, give them sugar. Give them things that are easy to swallow, and if they're really longer term diabetics, they usually have something called glucogel or a gel of fructose with them somewhere. Put that and rub it into their mouth. Be careful, they can have seizures, they could bite your finger, but get something into their mouth that has high levels of glucose or high level of fructose, and then they will clear up really quickly. Of course, now you're spiking their blood glucose levels, but that is not so bad. With a high blood glucose level, they still function perfectly well. It's just when they go low that they don't function that well anymore. Like if it gets at a really, really high point, no, there's coma, but it takes a while to get there. So as I was cutting the video, I realized I'd completely forgotten to tell you about the dawn phenomenon. The dawn phenomenon is a curious thing. It happens to type 2 diabetics and even people who aren't diabetic. And that is when you wake up in the morning with a very high level of blood glucose. Where does it come from? You didn't eat for 12 hours. So weird, huh? Well, I told you about the liver and its ability to store glucose. And this glucose is being released in response to a hormone called glucagon. It's secreted exactly from the same place as the insulin comes from, the pancreas. And the pancreas secretes it in response to sinking blood glucose levels in order to make sure that there's always enough glucose for the brain and the organs, and it's, we need those things. But if you are a type 2 diabetic and for some reason your cells are insulin resistant, then the cells will not take up that glucose that's being secreted from the liver. The glucagon goes out, glucose is secreted, insulin goes out to make sure that the cells take it up. The cells don't take it up. You're sleeping, your brain isn't needing that much energy. Your organs are also a little shut down at this point. And so the blood glucose just stays in the bloodstream until you get up in the morning. And then you have a high blood glucose level in the morning. And that is probably really scary when you look at your continuous glucose monitor. Well, oh my God, where did this come from? I didn't eat anything. Here are a few tips. Don't eat after 7 p.m. if you have that problem. Eat a low carbohydrate dinner, high fiber dinner. And when you get up and you have that high blood glucose level, do a little sport. Do a few push-ups, walk around the block, that kind of stuff. Just burn it off. It is not that problematic. It will influence your HbA1c. That is the measure of your blood glucose level over the last 90 days. So tell your doctor when you go there and say, by the way, I have dawn phenomenon. I wake up in the morning with 180 or 160, whatever it is, 150. It's not something to be super afraid and scared about, but it can happen. So, to recap, to do this really quickly, two kinds of diabetes, type 1, type 2. Type 1 is an autoimmune disorder that destroys the cells that create insulin. Type 2 is an acquired disorder over a amount of time that desensitizes the muscles in our body to the message that insulin sends. Insulin is a messenger hormone. It's being secreted by the pancreas in response to high blood glucose levels. It tells the cells in your body to take some of that glucose out of the blood and use it for their own work. Glucose is a nutrient. It comes from food, it's being absorbed by the small intestine, and it can be dangerous in high levels, but it's also badly needed by our body. So the job of the pancreas is to moderate the glucose that's in the blood, because the brain needs it, to the glucose that is allowed to go in our cells, and keep it all at around 100 milligrams per deciliter. Now you know it. You hopefully understand diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2. If you could do me a favor, go down there, click like, click subscribe, share, comment. It's a new channel, and I'd really like to hit the 100 so I can actually change that URL up there to just a medic from whatever the freaking URL is right now. So if that helped you in any way, shape, or form, if you've heard something new, if you liked it, click subscribe, click follow, click that little bell, and maybe leave me a comment if you liked it. Or didn't. Leave me definitely a comment if you didn't like it. I want to hear from you. Have an amazing day. My name is Mika. I am still just a medic.